I must say I'm a bit intimidating. I'm not really used to being in front of people. And well, I'm used to being in front of people, but with a camera behind and in front. Anyways, so I'll thank you in advance, and I would like to thank Carmen and Creative Mornings for having me today. So as she said, I'm a documentary photographer, and I'm going to speak to you mainly about my latest project, Land of the Displaced, which was shot in Lebanon during the context of the Syrian refugee crisis. I'm going to, well, try and explain what led me to that project, and especially to the way I worked on it. I'm going to explain how I reacted to shock while doing it, and I'm going to explain, well, how I came back to Europe, really, and that's maybe, well, something very important for me, because, well, spending 2 years in the Middle East can, well, change you a bit, and it did. To sum up my work, I would say I'm mainly interested by the relation between physical environment and the social cultural context, and that's, well, while it can be, it really means a relation between landscape and portraiture, really, and that's the two main fields I use as a photographer. And that made me, well, my childhood did influence on that. When I was a child, I moved, well, from country to country. I was born in France. I went to live in the US, went to live in the UK, went to live in France, and went to live in Belgium. And I did notice as a child that people were different from country to country, and maybe from the social environments. We did live in different social environments. So, for example, when we were in England, we were in northern England, and I remember, you know, feeling bizarre that my dad did not have tattoos, and that, moreover, that I wasn't allowed to have my ear pierced. And that maybe, well, back then said much more about the place than it does now, since, well, everyone's got their tattoos and ear pierced now. It's more common. I told a friend that I ate salad for dinner, for tea. You say tea over there. And he frowned at me. And, well, I didn't tell him I ate snails for Christmas, obviously. It's, but when we moved from France to, well, from England to France, and then we arrived in Belgium, and we arrived in the town of Waterloo, and that's, well, it's quite challenging for a French and Englishman, as you can imagine, and it's, other than that, the social setting was quite different, and I didn't feel I belonged at all in that place. I mean, and it's the first time I really recall, like, well, feeling like an observer, really, and the memories I've got from that time, I really remember being part of the scene, but looking at it, really, yeah, a bit like I'm looking at you now, actually. It's, and I think that's what is being a photographer, really. It's the ability to step back and really to look at a scene at its whole and to evaluate it. Well, I wasn't very good at school, so at the age of 15, I was allowed to study photography as a, well, technical option, I think that's how you call it in Belgium. And I saw an exposition of photographer James Nachtwey. Now, if you're not familiar with his work, he's one of the most touching war photographers in our times, and I think he did a lot of people my age saw his work and seeing, well, feeling completely moved by it, and wanting actually to become photographers after that. So I started following demonstrations and waiting for them to become riots, and that's well, it was good training, but not very interesting work. But it does teach you how to work fast. That's for sure. I was more reasonable for the choice of my end of studies work, and that was shot in Calais, and it's about migrants trying to pass the sea, the channel from France to England, really, and they're often blocked in Calais because it's very difficult to pass. And well, it's still the case. You've probably heard of Calais this way. But at that time, Nicolas Sarkozy, who was Ministry of Interior, had just closed the Red Cross Center of Sangatte on the grounds that it attracted migrants. And you'll see in this, it's shot I think 2 years after, you'll see that obviously Sangatte did not attract migrants. It was England that attracted them, and there were still a lot of refugees trying to pass. So to give you a setting about Calais, it's a harbouring town, and the migrants try to squeeze their way in the trucks that are going to England, really, and as it's very difficult, the odds are getting to England are very thin, really. So they end up like wandering in the town and waiting in waste grounds for charities to distribute food, for example. And this is the town centre of Calais. So it's try imagining seeing that. Well, you did actually see that in Brussels, maybe recently. But, Calais has been happening for quite a bit of time. They sleep in makeshift tents, really, built out of bits and pieces, really. And it's... They spend the rest of the day really trying to avoid the police. And like on this picture, which is shot on the grounds of a factory. And now the police can't enter here because it's private property. So you'll find a lot of migrants in the factories, really. And behind there is Calais. Now, another thing that I noticed in Calais was, and that's not really in relation properly to my work, but I did notice that the jungles are makeshift camps, slums, if you can call them like that, where they sleep at night, were organized depending on the country of origin of the people trying to pass. And furthermore, the people from Afghanistan had, which is, if you know, a multi-ethnic society, a multi-ethnic country, had separated themselves depending on their ethnical origin. So you could find a jungle for the Pashtuns, which are the main ethnic in Afghanistan. You could find a jungle for the Hazaras. Here is a Pashtun just getting dressed after having washed himself in used waters of a factory, since it's warm. Here are Hazaras in their makeshift tent. Here's a Somali refugee trying to get warm. It's shot December here, so it is cold, and here's another Afghani in the grounds of a factory. Now here they're running away from the police. They're running to the Pashtu jungle. And here's a food distribution. Now, I was struck by the fact how tired the people were when they arrived, really. And it's I was 18 years old, so you discover things quite abruptly this way. Now, making a living out of documentary photography is quite challenging, and it often never happens. So I led to specialize in portraiture, really, to make a living. And between my assignments, I used to, shoot subjects of my own, and the series of weightlifters, and that was still trying to get into a milieu that I didn't know, really. And I would invite people to my apartment, have a chat with them, people I met in the streets randomly, and I had set up a small studio in my apartment, and try to discover a bit more about themselves and try and take a portrait of them afterwards. And this is how I met Kate Rock. Now, she's a fashion blogger, and and I was really fascinated by her haircut, or the absence of her haircut. And so I invited her home, and she said yes, surprisingly. And while I was waiting for her, I was terrified, because I was running all these stereotypes of what a shaven head means. I was kind of imagining a neo-Nazi Russian, something like that. It's just really, I mean, I was totally terrified by what was going to happen to me when she came, and with who she was going to come particularly. All went well, and we managed to make some good pictures. But running back these stereotypes and my reaction to them, I decided to continue this series, because I realized that having a shaved head nowadays gives a kind of a message that it shouldn't do, but it does. You can, particularly for women, actually. And so I discovered that in some cultures you shave your head out of grief when you've lost a loved one, like in this case. Some people have lost their hair, and I didn't. Yes, I want to precise that I didn't work with people having had cancer or anything. It was this girl actually lost all her hair, and she had to face really harsh reactions when she was a teenager, because people were saying, you're a skinhead, you're racist, and all this, and it kind of made me really reflect on this status of not having hair, and maybe how we define the gender status depending on that, really. So it was about time that my companion, now wife, Valentina, had was working in Lebanon. She's a humanitarian, and her contract was extended, so it was time for me to choose to go or not to go. Now we'd been in Lebanon before in 2011, and so I knew kind of how the country was, how it was to work as a photographer specifically, and it is hard, because you've got various political groups, and everything is defined by these political groups, and you can't really go around the country taking a picture, and what happens is you get arrested quickly by official police, official military, or unofficial armed groups or political groups. So I decided to work with a very visible camera, and this is, we call it, I don't know if there are any photographers, but this is a view camera, and it's more or less a process that's been unchanged since the invention of photography. It's a very simple process. You've got the lens on this side, the focus plane on the other. It's a rear and front standard. Then you put the film on this side, and you focus before you put the film with a black veil, and that probably rings a bell to the image of all photographers. This is a more complicated object. You've got more movements that allow you to correct perspective, and I really like, first of all, the way it renders space, and that's quite. The other thing I like about it is the way you work with the view camera. It's a very slow process, and it's you have to evaluate a scene. You have to take out the tripod. Everything is very heavy, and you kind of frame what you're gonna shoot. Then you build the camera specifically with this camera. This is a studio camera. I didn't have the means to afford another one at that time. But and then it takes 20 minutes to take a picture on average. So getting back to Lebanon, and that was really how I wanted to work in Lebanon, on this kind of a bigger distance than I worked in Calais, really. To get back to Lebanon, I'm sorry, I'm going to show you a few slides with the map, and it's maybe a bit early for geography, but we have to explain the context in which I was working, and particularly in which the refugees arrived in Lebanon. Now, it's a country of now around 5 million inhabitants, and it was, to give you an idea, more or less 4 million before the refugee crisis, to give you an idea of the numbers. And it's located between Syria, Israel, and the Mediterranean Sea. Now you've got 1 million. Some of you working in the NGO field, you probably know the UNHCR data website, and that's very useful. But in Lebanon, there's 1 million registered Syrians. Now, there are much more, since not all of them are registered. Now, another factor are the Palestinian refugees. Now, they arrived when Israel was created, or a bit afterwards, and they're around 400,000 refugees and Palestinian refugees. And that's more or less that's the camps, because they're not allowed to live inside Lebanon. They have to live in camps, and so you've got in the south, in Beirut, in Baalbek, in Trablus, Tripoli, the Lebanese Tripoli, Nabati. To give you, and that's another information that's important. Lebanon is the most religiously diverse country of the Middle East, and so you've got Shiites, Sunnis, Muslims. You've got Druze, you've got Christians of sort, and you've got many more, but those are the main religions. And what's important about that is you've got all these religions create a community and have political groups, and this is one of the reasons that the civil war was so harsh, and why Lebanon is having a lot of difficulties right now too, with, for example, Hezbollah, which is a Shiite party, involved in the war in Syria, as an example. So to get back to my project, because I kind of understood that I wanted to work on this crisis, but I could never render how big it was. It's impossible as a photographer, even as a videographer, even as 10 photographers, to render how 1 million people changed the life of a country. So I did, by learning a tiny bit of Arabic and trying to, when you get in a new country, you arrive in a new country, you try and, you're familiar to things, you start to understand things, see how people dress, how certain people dress and all that. And I started to understand that there were visual signs of a refugee crisis. And in 2011, I'd already noticed the Palestinian camps, and if you've been to Lebanon, you can't not notice them. And it's quite impressive to see, really. And so I decided to kind of focus my attention and my work on the signs that had changed the Lebanese landscape, and therefore the Lebanese social scape, going back to my introduction. To do so, I went in 3 different areas, 3 different situations. The town of Arsal, which was a dramatic humanitarian situation. There was fighting, there was close proximity to fighting anyways. And I went to South Lebanon, where there was another relation towards refugees. It's controlled by Hezbollah, so you've got there was a relation with the refugees over there, and there was. And I went to Sheba, which is a small mountainous town, which is just stuck into between Syria, Lebanon, and Israel. So Arsal is located on the northeast of Lebanon. It's a bordering town. It's, if you're familiar to Lebanon, it's on the anti-Lebanon mountains, and you see this, kind of desert. And these are the mountains, really, and it's a suspended land between Lebanon and Syria. You can't consider it Lebanese, you can't consider it Syria. And what's important is that it's a Sunni enclave in a Shiite district. So the rest of the Bekaa Valley is Shiite, and they are Sunnis. And for confessional reasons, most Syrians are Sunnis. It's been a predominant choice for refugees, and geographically, because the first influx was from Homs. Homs is above Lebanon, really, and then as the fighting grew closer to Arsal, more and more refugees arrived, and you had quite a lot. At the time I took this picture, there were 40 to 60 families arriving each day, and it wasn't the biggest influx. It was the second one, but now it's as every bordering town, it's a trading town. and it was always before the war used to trade goods, and one of the main illegal goods to trade was illegal petrol from Syria against illegal hashish from the Bekaa Valley. And that settled a fairly good relation between the people from Bekaa Valley, Shiites, and the people from Arsal, Sunnis, and the people. Of course, since Hezbollah has been implicated in Syria, well, all these relations have ceased. And yet again, this is kind of what I use as my work, really, to use these images to kind of show these ideas, the petrol station abandoned, replaced by refugees. Now, another thing I said about I didn't say about this camera, it's very detailed. So in the print, you really see, well, there's refugees here, here, here. Obviously, we're on a screen here, so you won't see all that. It's a town that has been where the refugees have outnumbered the local population. And I think that's quite hard for us to imagine, really, and it was very, very hard for me to imagine. But this image kind of shows it. You've got 3 local houses against more than a dozen tents. And that's, well, and it was and this was at really the first time I arrived to Arsal, and you'll see that, yeah. So one other thing that's quite controversial about Arsal is that fighters from various fronts, like Al-Nusra Front, maybe you've heard of them, the Free Syrian Army, I hope you've heard of them, have used Arsal as a back base, not as a combat base, but to secure their family, to rest between 2 offensives. And these are fighters from the Free Syrian Army, and they were very jolly at that time because they had just won an offensive, and they actually proposed me to go to Syria. And well, I said I was married and that my wife didn't want me to go, and that's how I escaped from that. And we were hearing about kidnappings and all that, and you don't work in a war scene with that kind of camera anyways. Now, as it seems a desert, in the winter it rains a lot, and this kind of dust, awfully sorry, but in the picture you see streams of mud, really. And it rains a lot, and this dust just streams down. You haven't got any system to evacuate the water, of course. And this was while the fighting of the Kalamun Mountains in Syria, and it was the biggest influx Arsal had known. This camp was built in a day. Now, try and picture yourself this. You've got a waste ground in front of your house. The next day, you've got more than 100 refugees just building a camp, and that was something quite regular in Arsal at the time. Here are children returning from activities in the rain. Now, in a mountainous region, it snows a lot. This time it snowed early. There was a big snowstorm Alexa, and in the picture it shows refugees, Syrian social workers, excuse me, going to register new refugees in a no-man land between Syria and Lebanon. For the next picture, I'm actually gonna read part of my blog that I wrote at that time, and that's really maybe the relation to shock. It pictures, as you can't see, but you can just see a child here. It's a warehouse. The door of the warehouse slides open, revealing a swarming sight of at least 100 women and children, too weak to fight the bitter cold brought by snowstorm Alexa. Most women lie on bunk beds, covered in blankets. Children stare at us, torn between cold and curiosity. We have just opened a door of what they called as collective shelter. It can be a warehouse, a garage, an old factory, whatever, as long as it's cheap and big enough to shelter refugees, too diminished to afford better. In this case, widows and their children fleeing the battles of the Syrian Kalamun Mountains. I just realized that I'm standing in a puddle of water when a girl takes me to her grandmother. She took her to Arsal, fleeing the town of Gaha, leaving behind her her parents and a brother killed in one of the many bombings. I squeeze my way through the children and leave the scene. It's too much. Enough of compassionate and useless nods. These people need food, a decent shelter, and relief. At that moment, I can't give it to them. The repeated clicks of my camera is not going to help them. This is nothing, mutters a Syrian social worker afterwards. Go and look in the next house. In the car, we all know he's right. So moving to South Lebanon. This is the town of Tyr. You've maybe heard of it. It's an ancient city. It's the last big town before Israel. And you've got a Shia and a Christian community. It's a fisherman's town. And among this community, adding to this community, I would say, you've got 3 Palestinian camps. We lived in Tyr with Valentina, so it was my kind of home and resting place. This picture, I think you can see it. It's a portrait of Ali Hosseini Khamenei, the Iranian leader. We're in Hezbollah territory here. Next to a billboard advertising a beauty salon. And that sums up a duality that you often come across in Lebanon, which is, you've got a religious conservative leader next to an erotized mouth of a woman. And maybe it's kind of the duality between tradition and some sort of modernity, probably Western, but that's another debate. Now, getting back to the Palestinian camps. So this is the camp of Rashidiyeh. I'm standing on a platform between Tyr and Rashidiyeh, and the hills over there is a border with Israel. On the last Gaza offensive, there was heavy fighting here too. There was shelling going from there and going back from there. We could see all this from our house. But I chose this picture to kind of show the isolations that Palestinians face in Lebanon. Now, sorry. You have to understand, well, they're 3rd or 4th generation born on Lebanese soil, and they're still denied political and social rights. And this, you can even see in front the garbage hasn't been picked up really. And I particularly shot this picture in the mist to kind of signify that. Here are still in front of Rashidiyeh. Here are Palestinian refugees fishing from the shore. Now this could be an ordinary scene, but it's actually when you're a foreigner, when you don't own a Lebanese passport, it's forbidden to navigate on the sea. And that means that you need special permission from the military to use a boat and to fish. So it's easier. They can have it. It's not really the issue, but it's complicated, long, and expensive. So it's easier for them to fish from the shore. Now, the Syrian refugee camps are much smaller than in the rest of the country in South Lebanon, and we're outside Tyr here, and that's quite important. They're very discreet. You're really on the side of a road, really, and you can't really see it from the road here. Here we're in Marjayoun, one of the last towns before Israel, really inside inlands. But you've got women working in the crops here. Now, it was common before the war to have Syrian seasonal workers, Syrian men, working in the season, in the farming season, then going back to Syria to their families. Now they have brought their families with them, and the women and children have replaced the men since they're cheaper to employ. Here's another sign of maybe being a refugee, how feeling like a refugee is. This scene reminded me of some sort of fortification, or the idea I've had of a fortification, built on a hill, and that means safety to me. And I think part of being a refugee is seeking for safety. The other sign that's important is this image is the big stack of wood. That means that the stay is to be permanent, really, and you've got chickens in the settlement and all this. You see, it's a tent, but it's built to last, really, and that's how the situation was evolving when we were in Lebanon. This is the biggest camp in South Lebanon, and this man has just bought a car, and these cars are used in Lebanon to sell vegetables. So he's more or less investing into a business here, or he has to sell small vegetables. Once again, this is a sign that the stay is going to become permanent. Here are refugees warming up after a rain shower, excuse me. This one of the very few of the winter. Now, the fact that it didn't rain a lot in Lebanon this year meant that there meant that there was going to be a lack of water. And you combine this with an influx of refugees, the tensions, we were fearing a lot of tensions rising between local communities and refugee communities. And it did, actually. So here we're in Sheba. Sheba is a mountainous town, as I said. It's just next to Israel. It's on the blue line, UN peacekeeping blue line. So you can see on top there's small smoke going up. That's the UN burning their garbage. And there's a little pointy town. That's the Israeli checkpoint. It's where the 2006 war started. It's where Hezbollah kidnapped, a bit on the right of the image, where Hezbollah kidnapped 2 Israeli soldiers, which fired up the 2006 war, as you know. This is the refugees are fairly close to the local population, and they're from the other sides of the mountains in Syria, and there are no camps here because it's impossible to build them. Everyone lives in a garage, in a cellar, in an old built house. Here they're waiting for distribution, food distribution outside the municipality. And yes, these images, well, you can't see anything, and I'm awfully sorry about it. But you can actually, it's actually very dark, but you can just guess it's nothing artsy, I assure you. But you can just guess the portrait of a woman. And this place was really dark, and that's what struck me here. I mean, you live all day long in a dark place, and some argue that it's better than a tent, but I'll leave you to decide that. Here, in a mountainous region, you terrace the ground, and like every mountainous region of the world, and here these refugees are doing it for a landlord in exchange for rent. Here is a donkey, well, a guy with a donkey preparing it it's a mule actually, preparing it to go back to Syria to trade goods, and that's something quite common. But it's something that he won't be able to do anymore, since this road that he used is blocked, and it's blocked because the barriers have been closed by the Lebanese government, so no refugees can go back inside Lebanon. I ended my trip by actually being kicked out of the country, and by the military. It happens, and it took me a lot of time to get back in and to get my negatives processed. I was worrying a lot if I could. I had spent 2 years of my life wasted in Lebanon, but I didn't. I managed to get back in the country, but not allowed to take pictures anymore. So it was time for me to leave. Now I've been a bit long, I think, here, so I'll have to conclude the speech. But to quickly end it, it took me a lot of time to recover from Lebanon, and it took me a lot of hiking in the Alps. I was feeling very angry against Lebanon, very angry against the Lebanese people. More and more incidents were happening between Lebanese civilians against Syrian refugees. And after this hiking, I kind of, slept on my feelings really, and now I conclude that it's not for me to be critical about Lebanon. I mean, it's even arrogant for a Western guy coming to the Middle East and being so critical. And I actually don't think my work does that on the good side. But what Lebanon has given me is a new point of view really on Europe. After spending 2 years in the Middle East, I tend to look at Europe and reflect on the way we live in a different way, and this has led me to work on new projects and trying to go to the origin really of the industrial world, how we know it, and that was mainly the fact that you have no IKEA in Lebanon. Everything is made by craftsmen. You buy fish that's still moving. The vegetables from the next crop just next door. So on the good side, I had this kind of feeling. but there's the Alps, and this is, well, the first pictures of the project. But I won't bore you now. But what I really, keep from this trip is, well, yes, the ability to, as a photographer, to step back, but even to step back from your own culture, to better step in, to have a new point of view. And that's, for me, I think if I'm able in my career to keep getting this fresh eye on things, I think I'll manage to have done something. Thank you.